Hello, my name is Laura Saunders, and I'm from Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. And I'm going to be sharing some results from research I did on faculty perspectives about mis and disinformation across disciplines in the United States. There was a lot of information in this study, and so I know I'm going to be going through it relatively quickly in this presentation, but I'm more than happy to answer questions or engage in discussion during the live question and answer session. And you can always reach me by email or on Twitter, and you can see my email address and Twitter handle on the PowerPoint screen. So these are the questions that were guiding my research. I was really interested in the various ways in which faculty are thinking about mis and disinformation, or in some cases, maybe not thinking too much about it. So my questions were, are faculty across disciplines concerned about the spread of mis and disinformation? And if so, what challenges and threats do they perceive? Do faculty incorporate issues of mis and disinformation into their teaching? And if so, what strategies do they use? And what are their perceptions of their students' proficiencies in identifying and evaluating mis and disinformation? And then I was interested to know if there are questions, if there are differences across disciplines in faculty responses to these questions. So the research was conducted through a survey, and I also did some follow-up interviews, but there were very few people who agreed to be interviewed. So it really was not possible to gather any generalizable information from the interviews. So for this presentation, I'm really going to rely on the survey sample. So I drew a random sample of 688 faculty across all different disciplines from 429 public and private nonprofit colleges and universities in the United States. An initial invitation to participate in the survey was sent to faculty on September 10th of 2020. And then 3 reminders were sent over 6 weeks so that the survey was closed on October 21st, 2020. One of the limitations of this study is the response rate. I only got 86 responses, which is only 12.5%. And as you start to drill down into the various disciplines, in some cases there were only a handful of responses from a particular discipline. So again, it's really important to be careful about drawing any general conclusions from this study. However, I do think that the results give us some framework for thinking about how faculty are thinking about and addressing mis and disinformation in their classrooms in the United States. So let's talk a little bit about the results that I saw. First of all, I asked the faculty to answer some agreement statements that had to do with how they were thinking about mis and disinformation, including how they perceived various threats about mis and disinformation, and what they saw as viable solutions for combating mis and disinformation. So probably not surprisingly, faculty across the board largely agreed that mis and disinformation is a problem and that there's various aspects to this problem. And they also endorsed a range of solutions with varying levels of support, of course. But one thing that was quite clear is that attention to news literacy was the most highly rated solution of those that were given. So I want to break this data down just a little bit further. So this is an overview of the agreement statements, especially those that showed some consensus among the faculty across the board. So 94% of respondents said or agreed or strongly agreed that they're concerned about the spread of mis and disinformation on social media. That was the highest level of agreement. 93% also agreed or strongly agreed that they're concerned about the spread of mis and disinformation in news media. 89% agreed or strongly agreed that instruction in news literacy competencies is important in combating mis and disinformation. So again, among the solutions that were offered, news literacy competencies were the most highly rated. 88% of the respondents also agreed or strongly agreed that the spread of mis and disinformation impacts students' ability to find reliable and trustworthy information. So this gets back to a question that I ask later on about students' levels of proficiency and faculty's perceptions of those proficiencies. Finally, 85% agreed that the spread of mis and disinformation is a threat to democracy. And 75% agreed that instructors in higher education have a responsibility to teach news literacy skills. So again, while almost 90% agree that news literacy skills are important, a smaller proportion seem to feel that it's their responsibility to teach those skills. There was also some more variance in some of the agreement statements. So the ones we saw were where there was more consensus. Where I saw variance had to do in part with the perception of the impact of mis or disinformation in their fields. So one question just asked faculty if they were concerned about the impact of mis and disinformation on their particular field and discipline. And only 46% agreed or strongly agreed that they are concerned about the spread of mis and disinformation in their field. The highest level of agreement was among the health sciences at 73% and natural sciences at 60%. But there were also some faculty who disagreed or even strongly disagreed that there was a threat of mis or disinformation in their field and discipline. In fact, 100% of communications and journalism faculty disagreed that they were concerned about mis and disinformation in their field. And 66% of education faculty disagreed. Interestingly, while I saw some variance on this question, there was no statistically significant difference across the various fields about whether faculty were concerned about mis and disinformation in their field. There was also some variance in some of the other questions. So as I said, most faculty strongly agreed that news literacy was an important intervention for fighting mis and disinformation. But there was more variance about whether or not human fact checkers are an important solution for combating mis and disinformation. While 2/3 of the faculty agreed or strongly agreed that human fact checkers have an important role to play, there were 22% that disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. There was also variance about whether the spread of mis and disinformation on social media should be regulated. I didn't get into options about how that regulation would happen, whether it be through government or self-regulation, but regardless, there was some strong variance here. Just under 50% agreed or strongly agreed that there should be regulation, while 32%, almost a third, disagreed or strongly disagreed. And then the other question was about the importance of AI or artificial intelligence solutions, such as better algorithms in combating mis and disinformation. And there was perhaps the most variance here. 39% agree or strongly agree that AI solutions are important, while 20% disagreed or strongly disagreed, and 40%, a plurality, neither agreed nor disagreed. They were sort of neutral on this question. So this chart just shows the breakdown of the faculty's responses to those agreement statements. And again, I realize this may be a little bit hard to read right now, but again, I'm happy to answer more detailed questions later on and to share these slides more widely. But this certainly does show that there was strong agreement for certain statements, including just general concern about the impact of mis and disinformation on social media, and that there was more variance around other questions like the impact of mis and disinformation in each field. I also asked faculty to give their impressions of student proficiencies on certain news literacy competencies. So these included things like being able to evaluate different kinds of information and to check for things like relevance. And perhaps not surprisingly, faculty perceptions of student proficiencies really clustered around the middle of the scale. So in most cases, faculty did not feel like students were very proficient, but neither did they see them as being very weak. They sort of saw them as being at an intermediate level. They rated students best at evaluating information for relevance, with a third of faculty saying that their students are proficient or very proficient in this area. The lowest scores were for identifying mis and disinformation in scholarly sources, and 63% of faculty said students were weak or not at all proficient in that area. And so again, this chart shows the breakdown of faculty responses to these questions on student proficiency. And while it may be a little bit hard to read on this slide, it just shows that the sort of solid gray is somewhat proficient, and the the colors or the fill charts on either side are just a little bit above or below somewhat proficient. And so you can see here that most of the answers really clustered around that middle of the scale, with very few people claiming their students to be very proficient or not at all proficient. It's also important to recognize that there's a category of unable to comment. And I think this is important to recognize that there were some faculty who either are not addressing mis and disinformation in their classrooms and therefore felt like they really couldn't comment on their students' proficiencies, or perhaps are addressing it to some extent but are not assessing their students' learning in this area. So again, there were some faculty who didn't feel like they could assess their students in these competencies. So now I just want to talk very briefly about some of the differences that I saw across disciplines in terms of how faculty are addressing mis and disinformation. It's important to recognize that while I did see some variance across the disciplines, there was very little that was statistically significant. As I mentioned already, the support for misinformation solutions varied a bit, and not surprisingly, it varied a bit by field. So in other words, math and computer science faculty tended to be somewhat more likely to support AI solutions to mis and disinformation, whereas social science faculty seemed somewhat more likely to support news literacy competencies. But again, there wasn't anything that was statistically significant here. About 2/3 of faculty said that they address mis and disinformation in their classrooms, and that was across all fields. So there weren't a lot of people saying that they didn't address it at all. Those faculty that are addressing mis and disinformation in their classrooms are using lots of different approaches. But the plurality of them, so about 30%, said that they ask students to cite trustworthy sources in their work. And that was followed by assignments that require students to argue positions using trustworthy sources. In addition to that, some faculty reported incorporating explicit instruction in news literacy, assessing students' ability to evaluate mis and disinformation, and having assignments that specifically focus on students' ability to identify mis and disinformation. Perhaps not surprisingly, but somewhat disappointingly, very few of the faculty, only about 21%, reported that they work with a librarian in this area. And then finally, those faculty who said that they don't address mis and disinformation in their classrooms often said that they didn't think that mis and disinformation was relevant to their discipline. This was a somewhat surprising finding to me. While I expected that some faculty would not address mis and disinformation, I hypothesized that perhaps it would mostly be because they didn't feel that they had time to address it. And that certainly was the case for some faculty. But there were also a number of faculty who said that they didn't see mis and disinformation as being relevant to their field. While I could perhaps project that would be reasonable in some fields like creative writing or perhaps art, there were actually faculty in health sciences and math and other areas who said that they did not see mis and disinformation as relative to their field, which I found, again, very surprising and somewhat troubling. So I think that this is an area that deserves a little bit more exploration in order to find out specifically what these faculty focus on and how they are kind of conceptualizing their area of the field and the issues of mis and disinformation in order to understand how they are understanding these things to not be related. Because I would argue that there's a case to be made that there's issues of mis and disinformation in almost every field. as I mentioned before, there was very little statistical significance across discipline for all of these questions, which is somewhat reassuring because this means that regardless of students' major or area of study, they are about as likely to be getting instruction on news literacy and mis and disinformation. One area that I wanted to point out where there was statistical significance was faculty's agreement with the statement that misinformation is a threat to democracy. As you can see here, the solid black line was strongly agree. And you can see that there were a number of fields, including social work, social sciences, and education, where 100% of faculty agreed with that statement. But you could also see that there were places like history, where nearly 100% somewhat, only somewhat agreed, and there were some cases in, again, kind of interestingly, in health sciences and also in business where some faculty strongly disagreed with that statement. So again, I think this leads to an area of further exploration to kind of better understand faculty's conceptualizations of mis and disinformation within these fields. So just to kind of sum up quickly, most faculty are concerned about the impacts of mis and disinformation, and most believe that news literacy is an important intervention for combating mis and disinformation. And at the same time, they're somewhat skeptical of their students' proficiencies in this area. And also, very few of them collaborate with librarians. So I think that these findings have some implications for academic librarians. I think that the fact that faculty are concerned about mis and disinformation, and they believe news literacy is an important intervention, and they believe that their students are not necessarily very proficient in this area, means that there could be opportunities for librarians to support instruction for mis and disinformation, especially in certain disciplines where there seems to be greater concern and greater attention to this area. So I think we need to explore faculty's reluctance to collaborate with librarians. What's keeping them from working more closely with librarians in this area? I think as librarians try to make more inroads, they might begin with focusing on general education and extracurricular options. It seems like from other studies, one of the reasons that faculty are often reluctant to collaborate is because they feel like they don't have time, or as we saw, some feel like it is not directly relevant to what they teach. So if we can begin by implementing some attention to this area in general education, or extracurricular things like workshops, that's a way to start getting these things into the curriculum and onto people's radars. But I think it's important to not stop there. That should just be a first step. So in order to integrate beyond general education, I think we really need to raise awareness among the faculty about the potential roles that librarians can play, especially related to evaluation of information. I also think there might be some opportunities for librarians to provide what I call train the trainer opportunities. A couple of faculty members suggested that while they were interested in addressing mis and disinformation, they didn't necessarily feel like they had the content or the pedagogical expertise to do it. So I think that if librarians ran some workshops directed at faculty about how to think about mis and disinformation in their fields, what resources there are, how to develop assignments, and so on, that might be a good way to help faculty start to integrate this into their classrooms and also get them to be more aware of what the librarians can do for them in this area and how they might collaborate. So thank you for listening to this presentation, and I look forward to some discussion.